Let me finish by talking about forms of Christian community. Most of these forms we're all pretty familiar with. Probably the most common for all of us is the church congregation. It has a variety of sizes, and you've probably done some work on the differences on how communities function, whether they're family sized or whether they're megachurch. But they all hold in common some shared beliefs and voluntary participation. They gather regularly. They're usually oriented around a church building. This is the form of Christian community that most of us think of, with some subsets of small groups and other things that might meet elsewhere or meet on a non-Sunday or non-primary worship time. But this form of Christian community is not the only form, obviously, and it's changing, as we know, quite rapidly. The practicing community since the 1990s plus, as Robert Wuthnow put it in his book After Heaven, a sociologist from Princeton, he said, we've sort of lost God's address. We don't know where to find God anymore. Since the 1990s, 2000, particularly the last 25 years, people have not been particularly interested in thinking about Christian community as associated with a building or formal sorts of worship. Instead of choosing a church on the basis of belief or denominational heritage or ethnic heritage, I'm German, I'm Lutheran, I grew up Lutheran, I'm going to go to a Lutheran church. Instead of that, people have chosen, and this is a sociological reality, have chosen to say, what do these churches do? Or what does that community do? I want to find a match for what I'm interested in doing and what that congregation is doing. And this makes for something called the practice-based congregation. I would choose a community to belong with because they do small groups, they do children's ministry well, or they feed the homeless, or they're active in creation care, or they really have amazing outdoor activities, because I'm interested in outdoor activities. This is more a melding of personal interests with what a community does. And I keep using the word does because that's connected to practice. It has been very clear that people are less and less interested in joining communities on the basis of shared belief. It's much more powerful for many people to look for a community where what people do matches what I do. There's obviously some deficits to this, and some of your books will look at some of that later. But Diana Butler Bass was one of the primary people to think about this early on, and she indicated that there are some basic things that churches and small groups organize themselves around. And this is related to what we'll talk about in a minute with intentional and new monastic communities. But these groups don't necessarily have a full rule of life. It's that we're a hospitable church because we have an old building that's near unhoused population. We like living here. We like the vibe of the neighborhood. And we really want to do something about homelessness so we can all live well together. So at this church, we do Eucharist, we do food bank, we do extension ministries to the homeless. And yes, worship is a part of that. But that may not be the thing that brings people. It is this shared practice that's deeply rooted in identity in a community. Intentional Christian community, this is sort of more like the monastic model, but it's open to people usually of a life band or a geographical connection. People come together to share resources, deepen faith, come up with their own rule of life. I have up here a link to the Possibility Project. Some of you may know some about the Possibility Project. It just has morphed in the last year to Heirloom East Bay, and many of these same people are living in community on a farm, and I'll share that link with you later. But that's a group that comes together, lives together, has modified economic shared life together, and they are seeking to live on the land and be a beacon for God in a particular neighborhood. This is in the East Bay in San Francisco Bay Area. So that would be a model of an intentional community. Missional communities, these are larger groups that tend to deploy to be engaged in the neighborhood. I put this here because this is very much at the heart of some of the new paradigm communities or the new parish collective, the parish collective, and it comes out of mission thinking from Princeton via Leslie Newbingen and Daniel Guder. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this kind of thing. But rather than being organized as a community around what we do in our household, that then sometimes we go out and do good for others, there is a lesser distinction between those two things. It's that community exists for mission. Without mission, there is no purpose for community. You can read some of these values, but this is a community that is prophetic by its definition, that it exists to live differently, and it will be a community of contrast to the other kinds of communities that anybody might be a part of in a geographical community or geographical region. With all these various definitions, I asked you the other day to write a short definition of Christian community. I hope you have that in your mind as I share what I put together as a working definition of Christian community. Christian community is the shared life of those who follow Jesus in every time and place. Christians are bound by faith and mutual practices. Christian communities make space for God to transform individuals into neighbors and mutual co-agents that conspire with God for the renewal of all things. My definition makes sense because of the communities of which I have been a part. We'd have to unpack this together in order for it to be a live definition that made sense to all of us. It picks up that there's a shared life with Jesus at the center, but I hope that my definition is both one that's connected to the past but has an eye on the future, that's lived out in seeking transformation together in the here and the now. And all of this is lived within the love of God, the life of God. And so all of our definitions help us clarify in our own mind, but they have some living to do in community to make sure that the definitions actually compel and fuel the communal life. Here's one of the last things I'm going to mention, because this helps you get a sense of what I'm thinking about as I put the class together. That this kind of community, we define it theologically, we come up with our local definitions that help understand what we're doing, but that we recognize that community is something that's set within geography, it's set within society, it has cultural influences, it has countercultural influences, it has all sorts of interconnected systems that we both are aware of and sometimes we recognize are broken. So in faith formation, to be rooted in community, these are the 5 things that I hope that we continue to look for in the readings that you do going forward. One is every group has a charism. What's it called to do? The Nazarene Church has a charism to be a church that focuses on the holy life, the holiness of God that comes to us and works through us, and that this conversation around holiness is an important one. And we want to make disciples to the nation. There's a missional push to the tagline of the denomination. All denominations have a charism. They differ. All local churches and communities have a charism. What are the gifts of the people? What are you called to do to be that group for God and for neighbor in your neighborhood? What's the charism? The charism for the Benedictine monks in our movie was ora et labora. We'll talk more about that in a second. Then what are the relationships? Who are the people that pass on the Christian life? Some of this happens naturally. In a family, a grandpa or an auntie has all sorts of influences on a child beyond their parents. But in a church, how is this set up so that there are direct, one-on-one, two-on-two kinds of relationships where people are admonished, they're instructed, they're played with, they're called upon? How are these relationships thought to be formative? Sometimes it's organic. In a lot of churches, students tell me all the time they go to church for months on end and nobody says anything to them. There's no way for relationships to be fostered. This is connected to structures. If relationships are important and you want someone who's 7 or 8 or 10 years older than someone else or deeper in faith, regardless of chronological age, to help mentor someone who's younger or in crisis or whatever, what are the structures? How are you going to put those things together? Are you going to have prayer partners? Are you going to have a mentoring program? Do you have time after church where people can get a cup of coffee? Do you have space where they have coffee together? What are the opportunities that need to be structured in time and place so relationship and growth can happen? The practices are those actions that I mentioned before that Christians do or do not take to live in faithful response to God's grace and call. In our class, we have the Common Prayer Book because it's important for scripture, prayer, and community to be a part of our Christian community. What other practices are necessary? In our particular community, study is essential because we're a learning community. What are the practices? And then lastly, this is something that John Huckins and his work brings forward. What are the attitudinal approaches that help us to move from shallow adherence to formation? You can pray and do community, and you can read scripture, and things can stay at a very surface level. What else is required? John Huckins has these 3 that you'll read about in Mending the Divides at the end of the semester. He would say, see, immerse, contend, and restore. We'll talk more about those. But they are I'll just talk about the first one for a second. To see means that you walk into any situation and before you speak, before you take over, before you pass judgment, you observe. You see what's going on. You have a check in your spirit for humility, knowing you don't know all things. And so that you walk through life with an open set of eyes, spiritually and physically, to see what is God doing, where is the pain. And so you start with an attitude of seeing. That would be one of his postures. You may name that differently in your own community. In looking at the monks of Gods and Men, their charism, as I mentioned before, was to be a part of the Cistercians that follow the rule of St. Benedict. Ora et labora, prayer and work. What's their charism? To work in a local geography, pray the daily office, and out of that offer hospitality. In their case, they did it through mostly medicine and feeding. That was their charism, and that was given to them. Their relationships are primarily defined as brother to brother and neighbor. There would also be a brother to abbot relationship. They're fairly simple in the definitions of relationship. But then there are structures that help people learn to be brother to brother or neighbor to neighbor. They have a structure, some architectural structures, a cloister with a chapel. They have a garden. They have shared spaces, the refectory. They have their walking distance from the village, their neighbors. They don't have to get in a car to visit them. They have the structure of time in the daily office. That's just a few of them. Then what are the practices? Well, we saw them do Lectio Divina, chant, communal prayer, communal meals, formal study, discernment in community, practical service or mercy. We could go on and on. There's not too many Christian virtues or Christian practices that weren't there. And what were the postures? I didn't list them all here, but I wanted to ask you this for you to fill them in. But certainly submission. They were submitted to one another. There was a humility. There was one of the postures that I loved was the freedom of conscience, is the way I would put it. It was okay for one of the brothers to choose to get under his